Hello, my name's Stephen, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing another fantasy world building video and it's on one of my favourite topics, food and drink. Who doesn't love food and drink? In your fantasy world it can be as interesting and as different and as unique as you want, or it can be completely familiar. So I'm going to talk about a few ideas and pose some questions that hopefully get you thinking about the way you look at food and drink in your society. Just like everything else, food and drink in your society has a knock-on effect to the terrain, to the people, to the clothing, and everything else. It's all interconnected. So let's look at a few examples in our world that might give you some ideas and kind of project what you could do within yours. So let's start with religion in our world. Of course, Muslims don't eat pork, Hindus don't eat beef, and then you have other people for different reasons, whether it's Buddhists who take it to the extreme and they don't hurt any animals, then you have your people for health reasons or moral reasons, they're vegetarians or vegans. And then if you think about that in a fantasy world, what is the impact on society? So in our world it's a bit different because of transport and modern technology and all the rest of it, but if you project that onto your fantasy world, you can come up with some interesting ideas. So let's say there's a nation or a country or something or a region of your world where they raise cattle, let's say cows just for sake of example, but they don't eat them for any number of reasons, and that's for you. You could come up with something. It could be that this race isn't human that's raising all of these cattle, but they can make money, they can sell it to humans for the skin, for leather, the meat, they can do all of that, but they can't eat it because they physically can't ingest beef. They can only survive on plants and other kind of things. Or you could flip it on your head and say, what if there's one country or one race within your fantasy world that's carnivore that can only eat meat? What is the impact of that? What are the repercussions? That means you have to have lots of people who are raising different kinds of meat and looking after them, protection for them, all of the products that you make in addition to the meat that you come from the animals. They could then be used for trade and transport and other things to get money into their society. Then there's all of the jobs that are related to it, whether it's abattoirs, whether it's shepherds, whether it's transporting the meat. If they sell any of it, if they produce so much, maybe they sell it to other countries. They could do something like that. Then there's other things like tailors who could perhaps make, and people make with tanneries and make leather armour and leather clothing. If there's so much meat and there's so many animals, you'd probably make your clothing from that. And then there's other things to think about, like space. If they have thousands and thousands of animals that they raise because everybody has to eat a huge amount of meat, they're going to need an awful amount of space. So the land has to be able to sustain that many animals for grazing, which means, do they have enough space? Are they fighting for territory with other people? Have they come to some kind of arrangement? How does it work? How does it fit in within your society? This is why you need to have a strong foundation when you build your fantasy world. All of these things have to work together and create something that feels realistic. As I always say, you shouldn't spend years developing a fantasy world and not do any writing, but you need to do enough that if you suddenly turn left down a street, you know what's there already. There isn't just a blank space on the page, and it needs to feel like that for the reader, that they understand that there are layers built into this world, and even if we don't explore all of them within the course of the first story that you take them through, there is more beyond the page. Here's something else regarding food. Think about where you live. Maybe it's your town, your state, your country, whatever it might be. Is there a regional dish that people eat in your area? Why is it that? If you live by the sea, I'm going to guess it's some kind of fish and seafood that's very, very popular. If it's somewhere further inland, maybe hunting is quite popular. Maybe it's squirrels, maybe it's deer and venison, could be something like that. Maybe it's birds. In the UK, they used to hunt birds a lot, quail and pheasant and so on, so that could be a very popular dish. Think about the spices, think about the different ingredients in your local dish that people talk about. When people talk about the UK, where I live, people think about fish and chips and roast dinners and things like that, particularly with England. You think about Scotland and the first thing people will say is, oh, haggis. So there's all these national dishes that are related to history, that are related to the culture, that are related to the people, that go back generations. Then there's other things to think about, like how often do they eat this special dish, if you have one, or a particular kind of food? Is it something that they eat every day? Is it once a year? Is it for special occasions? Is it for religious occasions? all these other things you have to kind of try and bring in little touches here and there. Moving on, let's talk about drink. One of my favourite things, beer. Why was beer so popular historically? If you look back in history, beer was made by many, many people, whether it was monks or local breweries or all sorts of places. You go back thousands of years and they were making beer. Why? One of the reasons is people didn't understand the way we do today in terms of hygiene and germs and so on. But in the process of making beer, you boil the water, you get rid of a lot of the natural things in there that could harm someone, all of the germs and so on. So beer was safer to drink. These days, medically, people say you should drink lots of water. It's very good for your system because we have very, very clean water from rivers and streams that's all been treated and so on. In the old days, in your fantasy world, there's no such thing as sewage treatment plants and water works and this kind of thing. So they would drink water from rivers and streams. Sometimes they would boil it, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they cook with water, and during part of that process, the food was probably safer. Another thing is beer. You make very, very weak beer, sometimes called small beer, which is about 2%. But even in the process of making that, it won't get you drunk, but it's cleaner and it's safer to drink. In fantasy worlds, you often see people have wells if they're not near to a stream or a lake or the sea, because it's a good clean source of water. There again, it's something that has to be protected. So water is very important for survival, not just for humans, but animals and everything else, which then feeds into the plants and the terrain. And all of this has an impact on what people will drink and how they grow and how they survive. Another thing it could be, if it doesn't need to be something alcoholic, because I've mostly talked about beer, but of course in other countries outside the UK you have national drinks. They're very, very popular. You talk about Russia and people immediately say, oh, vodka, that's the drink, that's all they drink. And Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey and these sort of things. And now of course they make whiskey in many other countries around the world, but many of these drinks were made by local people originally before they were mass produced. So whether it was making vodka from potatoes or gin or whiskey or whatever it might be, it was what was available for people to make, to create alcohol to drink. Of course, to produce something like beer, you need malt, hops and yeast and lots of water, which is made safe and people can drink it. Talked about whiskey and gin and vodka. Those are made from other plants and stuff, so therefore it's space to produce them. It isn't nearly as much as, say, something like wine. Wine can be made from grapes, and of course you need vineyards, and therefore you need the right climate and you need the right kind of people to produce it who know the process to make wine. So then you start to think about society. Is wine drunk by everybody? Is beer drunk by only a few people? Is it the other way around? Who drinks it? Is alcohol forbidden by different races, societies, cults, religions? Who can drink it? Is there a limit? Obviously in most countries there's a bottom limit for what people can drink alcohol, but in your fantasy world, how does it work? In some countries they introduce alcohol to some people younger, so when they become adults they're not nearly as excited to get to that kind of 18th birthday, 16th birthday and then just start drinking, because they've been having a little all their life. There again, if a lot of countries or societies produce alcohol, can some races ingest it? Can some not? What are the effects on them? Moving away from alcohol, think about tea. Tea is one of the most, tea and coffee I guess, is one of the most popular drinks in the world these days. There's so many types of variety. There again, how is it produced? With the beans, with the leaves, people to grow them, people to dry them, all this kind of thing makes to jobs, which impacts the society, which impacts how people live. A final note on food and drink. Everything that I've been talking about so far is familiar. Potatoes and cows and sheep and beer and hops and yeast and all this kind of stuff. Because when a reader comes to your fantasy world, they want some level of familiarity. They want to be able to understand what's going on, the basic things in society without being completely lost. But why does everything have to be absolutely familiar? Now, I'm not saying you should replace the potato with something that you've made up that's very, very similar, but you've given it a new name, because ultimately, what's the point? However, you could introduce something different. People have been creating made-up herbs and flowers and all this kind of thing in fantasy worlds that have unexpected, unusual and brilliant effects on a person. You could do something like that, but equally you could introduce something, flora or fauna, that we haven't seen before, that isn't from our world, that has very unique and interesting and special properties. Why not? Why couldn't you do something like that? I think too often when we're creating a fantasy world, we tend to be a bit blinkered. We go in and say, this is the kind of world I'm creating with these kind of peoples and these kind of stories, and then off we go. Bring in more of the fantastic. I always keep saying this because it is important. If you want to stand out, if your book wants to be different, if it wants to be unique, you need to have something that we've never seen before, because the market is incredibly crowded. So, what if you had a Jarlsberry, just something completely made up, that when people drink it, it makes them invulnerable for a few hours, or they can heal really, really fast, and it only lasts a couple of hours. What would that do to society? What would that mean? People will drink it before they go into battle, and for like an hour, any wound that they have, short of having their head cut off, means they can keep going. Then you think of, right, who can get access to it? Where is it grown? What temperatures does it grow in? Is it a controlled substance? Are only certain members of society allowed to have it? Is it illegal for anybody else? What are the rules? What are the repercussions if someone's caught having this thing and they're not supposed to? Equally, it could be something a bit more gentle. It could be that this particular drug gives person visions and it's only reserved for religious societies or religious groups or churches or priests who say they're the only ones that are able to process it, which could be a complete lie. So bring something that we haven't seen before. Add a little X factor to the world through the food and drink, through the society, and create something interesting. That's all I'm talking about for today, but I'll be back soon with another world building video.